When Christopher Columbus finally secured the financial backing he needed to explore a western route to India, he and the Pinzon brothers, along with 90 other men, set sail from Spain in August of 1492. 8 weeks later, they made landfall in a harbor near the eastern tip of Cuba. Columbus wrote to Ferdinand and Isabella, "I have never seen anything so beautiful. The country around the river is full of trees, beautiful and green, and different from ours, each with flowers and its own kind of fruit. There are many birds of all sizes that sing very sweetly, and there are many palms different from those in Guinea or Spain." But more relevant to the future of the island was his entry in his private log. "As soon as I arrived in the Indies, on the first island which I found, I took some of the natives by force in order that they might learn and might give me information of whatever there is in these parts." Of course, what Columbus wanted most was gold. On his return to Spain, he wrote that in future voyages he would bring Isabella and Ferdinand back as much gold as they need and as many slaves as they ask. Though Cuba never proved to be a viable source of gold or slaves, the conquistadors ruthlessly exploited the local populations in their pursuit of what wealth could be extracted from the island. In 1511, Hatway, a Taino chief on the nearby island of Hispaniola, fled the atrocities there to warn the Tainos of Cuba of what to expect from the Spanish.
Os haremos esclavos y dispondremos de vosotros a voluntad. Nos apropiaremos de vuestras posesiones y os causaremos tanto dolor como podamos.
Hatway went on to lead the first fight against colonialism in the New World, and within a year he was captured and burned at the stake. Asked if he would accept Jesus before dying and thereby go to heaven, he replied that he would choose hell over being anywhere near more Spaniards. The Cuban Taino population, estimated at 75,000 in 1500, was reduced to a mere 3,000 by 1550. As this population declined, slaves were brought from Africa to work the coffee and sugarcane plantations that became the heart of the colonial economy. It is estimated that over 1 million slaves were brought to Cuba from West Africa, their numbers ultimately surpassing Cubans of European descent. 3 slave rebellions in the early 1800s were violently suppressed and their leaders brutally executed. Cuba remained one of the most common destinations for slave ships until the late 1860s, 50 years after Britain and Spain ended their slave trade. Slavery was not abolished in Cuba until 1886. By the late 1800s, Cuba had endured over 370 years of Spanish colonial rule. Despite very real political and economic reasons for wanting independence, Cubans did not seriously attempt to throw off foreign domination until late in the 19th century. From 1868 to 1878, they mounted a bitter, bloody, and unsuccessful campaign later called the 10 Years' War. A shorter, equally inconsequential rebellion then erupted from 1879 to 1880. 15 years later, in 1895, a better organized struggle for independence was initiated under the deeply respected leadership of José Martí. A poet, journalist, and Cuban freedom fighter, Martí united a nation divided by class in the struggle against 2 oppressive forces, Spain and the United States. Though Martí was killed in the first year of fighting, the war went on without resolution until 1898, when the U.S. declared war on Spain following the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. The Spanish-American War was fought in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and after 10 short weeks, the American victory brought Spain's colonial empire to an end. The subsequent Treaty of Paris compelled the Spanish to relinquish all claims on Cuba and numerous other territories. A U.S. occupation force was established in Cuba for 3 years, imposing much-needed order on a chaotic Cuban political and economic landscape. In 1901, a constitution was passed, and in 1902, the U.S. occupation ended and the Republic was declared. However, both the Constitution and the U.S. withdrawal were subject to the Platt Amendment, which guaranteed, first, that Cuba would not transfer any of its land to any foreign power but the United States. Second, the establishment of a U.S. naval base at Guantanamo. And third, the right of the U.S. to intervene in Cuba to preserve order. After 4 centuries of colonialism, 3 decades of wars of independence, and more than 3 years of foreign occupation, the Republic of Cuba had finally gained its formal independence. However, it was by no means free from the dominant influence of its powerful neighbor to the north. The Republican period ran from 1902 to 1958. There were a dozen largely democratic, constitutionally based elections in that brief window between colonial domination and Castro's revolution. However, there were also 3 major armed rebellions and numerous lesser uprisings, 3 elected presidents who forcibly extended their control beyond their term of office, and 2 extensive U.S. interventions under the Platt Amendment. During this period, the wealthy upper class was repeatedly in conflict with the workers and intellectuals. While most Cubans wanted a stable, lawful society, those not in power consistently ignored the Constitution and resorted to violent uprisings. In the final decades of the Republic, both of these themes were dramatically embodied in the single figure of Fulgencio Batista. In 1933, Batista rose to power through an unusual coup that was not led by top military officials, but by a group of sergeants frustrated by their inability to secure promotions. Batista then appointed himself chief of the armed forces. He effectively controlled a temporary 5-member presidency and a string of puppet presidents until 1940, when he himself was elected president. In that election, Batista ran with the support of the Communist Party and the labor unions that remained loyal to him to the end. He established the 1940 Constitution, considered progressive for its time. After finishing his term, he lived in the United States, splitting his time between his home in Daytona Beach, Florida, and the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. He returned to Cuba in 1952 to run for president. When he faced certain electoral defeat, he led a second military coup that preempted the election.
El general Batista, ante los micrófonos de todas las emisoras del país. ¡Silencio! ¡Silencio!
Hablo al pueblo de Cuba desde la ciudad militar esta vez, en donde he tenido que regresar.
Back in power, Batista suspended the Constitution and revoked most political liberties, including the right to strike. He then aligned with the wealthiest landowners and presided over a stagnating economy that widened the gap between the rich and poor. Increasingly corrupt and repressive, the government began to systematically profit from the exploitation of Cuba's commercial interests. Batista received $1 million a year from the American mafia, who controlled the gambling, prostitution, and illicit drug trade in Havana. He also negotiated lucrative contracts with large U.S.-based multinationals, lining his own pockets and those of his associates. To quell the growing discontent among the populace, which gave rise to frequent student riots and demonstrations, Batista established tighter censorship of the media. Utilizing his Bureau for the Repression of Communist Activities, he carried out wide-scale violence, torture, and public executions. In the fall of 1959, then-Senator John F. Kennedy had this to say about Batista. Fulgencio Batista murdered 20,000 Cubans in 7 years, and he turned democratic Cuba into a complete police state, destroying every individual liberty. Yet our aid to his regime and the ineptness of our policies enabled Batista to invoke the name of the United States in support of his reign of terror. I believe that there is no country in the world, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation are worse than in Cuba. 1945, 19-year-old Fidel Castro began studying law at the University of Havana. Admitting he was politically illiterate, he became embroiled in student activism, passionately embracing anti-imperialism and opposing U.S. intervention in the Caribbean. Critical of the corruption and violence within the current government, he campaigned for the presidency of the Federation of University Students on a platform of honesty, decency, and justice. But he was not elected. Over the next 7 years, his beliefs and actions moved steadily to the left. He took up the causes of the poor in the Dominican Republic, Colombia, and finally Cuba itself. In the election of June 1952, Castro wanted to run for Congress as a member of the Ortodoxo Party. Senior party members, however, feared his radical reputation and refused to nominate him. Instead, party members in Havana's poorest districts nominated him as a candidate for the House of Representatives. It appeared that the Ortodoxo Party under Roberto Agramonte would win the elections until Batista staged his second coup just 3 months prior to the voting. Castro brought several legal cases against the Batista government, but they went nowhere. Then, on July 26, 1953, 140 young Cuban men and women, led by Fidel and his younger brother Raúl, stormed the Moncada barracks outside Santiago de Cuba, hoping to capture enough weapons to start a revolution. Despite meticulous planning, it was a massacre. 31 rebels were killed during the attack and others fled. Subsequently, the rest were rounded up and more than 60 were tortured and executed. Batista called for 10 men to be killed for every one of his soldiers who died at Moncada. Published photographs of the mutilated bodies of Cuba's youth repulsed the nation and made a hero of the man who had led the assault. At the request of the Catholic Church, Fidel, Raúl, and a handful of survivors were tried. Sentenced to 15 years in prison, Fidel had this to say: "I do not fear prison, as I do not fear the fury of the miserable tyrant who took the lives of 70 of my comrades. Condemn me, it does not matter. History will absolve me." After 22 months, Fidel and his compatriots were released. Fidel and Raúl then left Cuba for Mexico, where they continued to plan their revolution under the name of the 26th of July movement. There, Castro met other Cuban exiles, as well as Argentine doctor and Marxist-Leninist Ernesto Che Guevara. A proponent of guerrilla warfare, Che became an important confidant, helping to shape Fidel's political beliefs. In December 1956, Castro and 81 men landed in Cuba to wage war on Batista. They were immediately attacked by Batista's rural guard. Only 18 survived as they made their way into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Slowly winning the trust of local peasants, their numbers began to grow. As militant groups throughout Cuba rose up against Batista, police responded with mass arrests, torture, and extrajudicial killings. They hung corpses on trees to intimidate dissidents. By this point, virtually all Cubans opposed the regime. Increasingly aware of Batista's corruption, violence, repression, and military failures, the Eisenhower administration withdrew support in March of 1958 and imposed an arms embargo on the island. In his last attempt to regain control of the Sierra Maestra, Batista sent in 12,000 troops. Although Castro had only 300 men at his command, Batista's army suffered heavy losses, and within a month the 1st Battalion surrendered. Appalled at the human rights abuses that they were ordered to carry out, many of Batista's soldiers defected to Castro's rebels. 6 months later, with the rebel forces quickly closing in on Havana, Batista and his closest advisors fled Cuba with over $100 million. His request to return to the United States was denied, and he lived out his years in Portugal. On January 8, 1959, Castro entered Havana amidst widespread celebrations and set up home and office in the penthouse of the Havana Hilton Hotel. With power in his hands, 32-year-old Fidel Castro installed the politically moderate lawyer Manuel Leo as provisional president. Castro exercised a great deal of influence over Leo's regime, which was now ruling by decree. Castro ensured that the government implemented policies to cut corruption and fight illiteracy. The Cuban people's rents were cut in half, telephone and utility rates dropped. Although he repeatedly denied that he was a communist to the press, Fidel began meeting members of the Popular Socialist Party to discuss the creation of a socialist state. In less than 2 months, Castro appointed himself prime minister and began eliminating all opposition. Former Batista officials were tried as criminals, and as many as 500 were executed, some live on Cuban television.
The purpose of today's gathering is to show the whole world that all Cubans are united in the rebel victory and that all of them support the execution.
When the young people would appear murdered in the streets with a top to their heads, when the yards of the barracks would be full of cadavers, when our women were violated, when the children were murdered, when the police force would go into the embassy to assassinate our people, no one made a campaign against Cuba.
New York's Pennsylvania station rarely has seen anything like it. Only the magnetism of a Castro could produce it.
That April, Fidel traveled to the United States, where he was widely received as a charismatic leader dedicated to improving the lives of ordinary Cubans. In Washington, President Eisenhower avoided Castro, passing him off to Vice President Richard Nixon, who later told Eisenhower he believed Castro was a communist. When Fidel returned to Cuba, he moved rapidly to implement urban and agrarian reform. He repealed the tremendous tax advantages that foreign landowners had previously enjoyed and broke up large holdings, beginning with his own family's estate. "200,000 peasants were given title to land they had once worked."
As Castro surveyed the crowd of 1 million gathered on that day, he compared Cuba's new government to ancient Athens, except better, because Cuba's revolutionary government was not for the privileged classes or the oligarchy. This, he said, is true democracy.
Cuba's socialist ideals and strategic location gave the Soviet Union a valuable foothold in the Western Hemisphere. In early 1960, the Soviet First Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan visited Cuba and arranged a trade agreement that was very supportive of the Cuban economy. The USSR agreed to buy Cuban sugar at inflated prices and sell oil to Cuba at reduced rates. When the crude arrived, American-owned oil refineries, under pressure from the U.S. government, refused to process it. Castro then nationalized the oil companies, and the Eisenhower administration responded by imposing a trade embargo. They also provided $13 million in funding for the CIA to overthrow the Cuban government. By the end of the year, Castro nationalized virtually all of the U.S.-owned companies in Cuba.
¿Cuál era la alternativa del gobierno revolucionario? Traicionar al pueblo. Y no lo serías con toda seguridad si en vez de ser nosotros leales a nuestro pueblo, hubiésemos sido leales a los grandes monopolios norteamericanos que explotaban la economía de nuestro país.
In April of 1961, the U.S. initiated the Bay of Pigs invasion. The first phase was a bombing of Cuban airfields by a small group of planes painted to appear as Cuban. This alerted Castro to the impending invasion, and he ordered the arrest of over 20,000 suspected counter-revolutionaries. A day later, 1,400 CIA-trained fighters landed at the Bay of Pigs and engaged in a firefight with local militia. Castro took personal command of the battle, quickly defeating the invaders and capturing nearly 1,200 of them. The victory had tremendous significance in Latin America, where no government had previously withstood a serious challenge by the U.S. Just 6 months later, the United States and the Soviet Union brought the world to the brink of nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Upon discovering Soviet missiles through aerial reconnaissance, the U.S. implemented a blockade of all ships bound for Cuba. After 13 days of delicate negotiations, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. commitment not to invade Cuba and an understanding that the U.S. would remove their ballistic missiles from Turkey and Italy. Over the next decade, trade deals and ideology supported the Cuban-Soviet alliance, while Castro's eagerness to export revolution strained it. Though he acted independently on many fronts, Castro recognized Cuba's economic dependence on the Soviet Union. In August 1968, Castro relented to Brezhnev's pressure and denounced the leaders of the Prague Spring, praising the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. Cuba's dependence on the Soviet Union finally ended when Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power. Gorbachev implemented sweeping reforms, allowing freedom of the press and economic decentralization. Like many orthodox Marxist critics, Castro feared that the reforms would weaken the socialist state and allow capitalist elements to regain control. Gorbachev eventually conceded to U.S. demands to reduce support for Cuba. When he visited Castro in April 1989, Gorbachev informed him that there would be an end to subsidies. Though economically devastated, Cuba was no longer under anyone's shadow.
Si mañana o cualquier día nos despertáramos con la noticia de que la URSS se desintegró, aún en esas circunstancias, Cuba y la revolución cubana seguirían luchando y seguirían resistiendo.
The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 decimated the Cuban economy. Both imports and exports fell by 80%, and the gross domestic product dropped by 34%. Imports of food and medicine were severely reduced, and in some cases stopped altogether. Before 1990, petroleum had been Cuba's second largest export, re-exporting any Soviet oil it did not consume to other nations for a profit. But now their oil imports dropped by 90%. With the loss of cheap crude from Russia, gasoline became unaffordable for ordinary Cubans, and mechanized agriculture and food distribution systems all but collapsed. Chinese bicycles were imported to replace cars, and factories performing non-essential tasks were shut down. Oxen began to replace tractors, people resorted to firewood for cooking, and electricity was available for only 8 hours a day. The Helms-Burton Act of 1996, which strengthened the American trade embargo against Cuba, compounded the island's woes. During this so-called special period, Cuba teetered on the brink of famine. People survived by drinking sugared water and eating virtually anything they could get their hands on, including family pets and the animals in the Havana Zoo. To bolster the economy, Castro made significant changes while trying to preserve the essence of socialism. Farmers' markets and small-scale private enterprises were legalized to stimulate economic growth. The US dollar was made legal tender. The government diversified its economy into biotechnology and tourism, the latter outstripping Cuba's sugar industry as its primary source of revenue. Environmentalism and sustainable agriculture were so pervasive that by 2006, Cuba was the world's only nation to meet the United Nations definition of sustainable development. Gradually, the economy recovered, largely aided by increased trade with the socialist government of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Cuba sent as many as 40,000 medics to Venezuela in exchange for 90,000 barrels of oil a day at reduced rates.
Siento un placer tan profundo de haber nacido en tu suelo, porque me gobierna el cielo de este mundo, oh patria de Maceo y de Martín. Cuba, mi patria querida, para ti es mi inspiración. Cuba, mi patria querida.
In July of 2006, Fidel underwent surgery for intestinal bleeding and delegated his presidential duties to his brother Raúl. 2 years later, he relinquished his position as President of the Council of State and Commander-in-Chief. He remarked, "It would betray my conscience to take up a responsibility that requires mobility and total devotion that I am not in a physical condition to offer." Fidel Castro governed for 52 years and was the longest-serving non-royal ruler in recent history. On December 17, 2014, in less than 24 hours, 3 historic events changed the Cuba-U.S. relationship forever. First, a telephone conversation took place between Presidents Raúl Castro and Barack Obama, signaling the end of a political standoff between the two countries that spanned 5 decades and 10 U.S. presidents. This conversation followed over a year of secret negotiations conducted by Canada and the involvement of Pope Francis, who had sent personal letters to Obama and Castro urging them to exchange prisoners and improve relations. That same day, an exchange of captives took place. The U.S. released 3 Cuban spies for an American spy and a U.S. aid contractor, Alan Gross. Castro also released 53 Cuban political prisoners. And finally, Presidents Obama and Castro gave simultaneous public statements on television that evening, announcing an end to half a century of hostility between the two countries. 9 months later, in a separate gesture of goodwill and to celebrate the arrival of Pope Francis, Raúl Castro released over 3,500 political prisoners. In July 2015, the Cuban flag was raised over Cuba's embassy in Washington, D.C., and a month later, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry officiated at the reopening of the American embassy in Havana. In March of this year, U.S. President Barack Obama and his family made a historic 3-day trip to Cuba to meet its people and engage in talks with President Raúl Castro. It was the first trip to Cuba by a U.S. president in 88 years. By abandoning a nearly 6-decade-long policy of isolating Cuba, the Obama administration is doing what it can to make this policy shift irreversible, no matter who wins the White House in November 2016. And Cuba is exploring ways to establish open relations with the United States without losing its socialist identity.